For a colocation operator, you really do need two different kinds of playbooks. You need a playbook for potential clients, potential decision makers that are hyper local, that are able to drive that are able to get to your facility within 30 to 60 minutes. That's one particular playbook. And that playbook, in almost all cases, is going to be centered around getting FaceTime, not Apple FaceTime, but actual visits to your facility by the decision makers and other stakeholders on that decision committee. And typically the playbook that most colocation operators, colocation data centers gravitate around is events. And it could be other people's events where you're using that as a funnel or a magnet to get people to visit your facility. Or in a more ideal scenario, I'd recommend actually hosting educational events at your facility on a regular basis. So if you have a classroom that can hold, doesn't have to be huge, you could hold 10, 15, 20 people, and you have the groundwork for that. If you have a conference room that can hold 10, 15, 20 people, or even a foyer where you can set up chairs for a 2 or 3 hour, 1 hour, 90-minute, whatever, breakfast seminar, lunch and learn, or something like that, where you're pairing education with a site tour. This is the playbook for high value decision makers to educate and build trust with these folks. Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I am thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales, marketing, and go-to-market related challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscalers, colocation providers, edge, modular, wholesale data centers, and the dozens of different kinds of technology companies that sell to and partner with data center related businesses, the dozen or so facilities related companies in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, as well as construction, real estate, and investors in and around the data center ecosystem, plus all of the fantastic outsourced sales and marketing companies that specialize in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And it doesn't matter which role that you sit in within a go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in sales, marketing, account management, sometimes known as customer success, product, channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the executive leader, the executive sponsor, the orchestra conductor, making sure that everyone is playing their instruments at the right time, at the right tempo, at the right speed, sitting in the right seats on the bus to know exactly, to make sure that your company is totally aligned and positioned to capitalize on this enormous period of unprecedented growth in and around digital infrastructures. If this is the first time you're joining us for our data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show, welcome. And we'd love to know in the comments where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry. So what's on the agenda for today? I'm going to tackle a handful of the biggest questions, the most pressing challenges faced by go-to-market sales and marketing professionals, including how to generate qualified hyperscale data center leads. After that, we'll look at how to grow a data center cooling solutions business. Then we'll turn our attention to how to improve data center power solutions branding. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we head into the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how to access colocation data center decision makers, plus how to develop a strong modular data center brand. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how to simplify edge data center sales processes. If you have an idea for a topic that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching from. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question. So first up is, how do we generate qualified hyperscale data center leads? How do we generate qualified leads for hyperscale data centers? That's a great question. And it's one that's got a lot of relevance, especially in and around go-to-market strategy and lead generation, lead nurturing, sales enablement, sales cycle acceleration. because when it comes to hyperscale, it's actually quite common that your ideal client profile and your target account list tighten up quite a bit. Why? Because unlike colocation, where if you're in colocation sales in a given geographic area, you could have thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of potential customers. When it comes to hyperscale, you may only have a few dozen. It could be the big hyperscalers, it could be co-location operators that need to white label something that you're doing to give a particular client they're working with hyperscale capability, but it's certainly a much shorter list of potential clients. So what's super important for generating these qualified hyperscale data center leads is to get very self-aware about the size of hyperscalers that you can win with and the size of hyperscalers that you can't. In other words, when we look at your case studies page, what do they have in common? And are there certain hyperscalers that need to have a certain amount of power capacity requirements, that need to have a certain amount of budget, that need to have a certain amount of ability to commit to long term? What are the factors that make that hyperscaler a uniquely good fit where they're getting a ton of value from their relationship with you, and vice versa, they're a great fit for your company's short-term, intermediate term, and long-term growth goals? So this is basic ideal client profile 101. Where are they located? For a hyperscaler that's looking for place, space, and power, cooling, telecommunications in your facility, they could be conceivably located anywhere on the planet. But the question is, how well positioned is your company to have hyperscale clients that are way beyond your local geographic area, that are across the country, across the continent, across the planet? So geographically, where they're located. Second, how big or small do they need to be? Can your company truly sell to a hyperscaler regardless of their size? If they're on the smaller side of hyperscaler, if they're on the largest side of hyperscaler, can you literally like sell to AWS? Can you sell to Google? Can you sell to Microsoft? Can you sell to Rackspace? Can you sell to Meta? Like, where is the line that gets drawn on who's a good fit, who's too big, who's too small to afford your minimums, who's so large that it may overwhelm your team's current roadmap capability? So set that band in terms of number of employees, because when it comes to lead generation, at some point, no matter how clued in you are to megawatts, kilowatts, perhaps even gigawatts of capacity and square footage in particular locations, as you hand this off to marketing and sales professionals, you'll need to almost certainly normalize the prospecting and lead generation and qualification process around a certain number of employees. And then there are certain industries where you're an especially good fit or where you're not a good fit. Because when it comes to a geographic part of your ideal client profile, and especially geography plus industry, but even geography in certain cases, certain compliance requirements, certain certification, certain accreditation requirements pop up. So either your company is credentialed to be able to, certified to be able to deliver to those certain kinds of industries, those verticals, those business models in a particular geographic area, or you're not. If you are, great. That becomes part of your ideal client profile and it factors into how you build out your target account list. If you're not qualified to deliver to a certain kind of vertical, like if you're going to get knocked out on healthcare or education or e-commerce or government or something like that, then it's better to know about that ahead of time and make that an explicit exclusion from your ideal client profile. So once you have those three factors documented in your ICP, geographically where you can do business, where these leads need to be, company size, headcount, or revenue. Usually headcount is easier, number of employees is easier, and industries that are an especially good fit and industries that are a really lousy fit that you get knocked out on, that you really wouldn't be able to deliver on. That's your ideal client profile. From there, you should be able to build out a target account list of the companies that would match up really, really well to that definition and fall within the range of having a hyperscale need. For a lot of companies, this could be as few as a couple dozen accounts, which means that these couple dozen accounts more than likely have massive potential revenue value to your company. So with that in mind, there's very, very few kinds of marketing, demand generation, lead nurturing kinds of campaigns that you that are off limits. A lot of times when it comes to colocation, especially retail colocation, the unit economics are so low that it's borderline whether you can even afford inside sales to be able to close those sales, or whether it needs to be like a self-driven, self-service sign up, similar to like web hosting. Assuming the unit economics with hyperscale are like the opposite end of the spectrum, where you're routinely talking about multi 6-figure, 7-figure, maybe even 8-figure deals, pretty much everything becomes viable for lead generation. It's just a matter of what your team is best positioned to execute on. So once you have the target account list, let's figure out who the buyer personas are, who the most important people on that decision committee are going to be that you need to create awareness in front of and educate and build trust with. Because the fastest way for you to get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box so they can see your true points of differentiation is to make sure that you're showing up as an expert at delivering data center facilities as a data center operator for hyperscalers. And the best way to demonstrate that, unless you have the benefit of already having a massive brand, is to show up as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and maybe even thought leaders at the intersection of their geographic area, their company size, their industry, and their particular job role. You're not trying to boil the ocean. You're not trying to declare topical expertise on anything and everything having to do with hyperscale for any kind of business anywhere on the planet, no matter how big or small they are, no matter what industry they're in, and no matter what job role this particular person is in. No, we're a lot more specific. We're like, okay, for a CFO, for a CTO, for a CEO, for a board member, for these 4 or 5 stakeholders, how are we going to really dial into what their biggest goals are and what their biggest struggles are when it comes to hyperscale, when it comes to entering into these massive hyperscale deals? And we're not going to guess, we're going to actually do our homework. We're going to do the research. So in a perfect scenario where you already have multiple hyperscale clients, face-to-face conversations, Zoom meetings, whatever it takes to bribe people potentially with gift cards to get time on their calendar to help you get that interview, get that perspective, is incredibly valuable. Because the most important part of this not only is avoiding your assumptions by just talking to your internal stakeholders, but getting the external stakeholders in those roles, like the board members, the CEOs, the CTOs, the infrastructure executives, whoever else is involved, finance executives. It's not only getting consensus on their biggest goals and challenges, but getting it in their own words, not what we think those words are, but what the words actually are. And we're going to nail that down because we're going to do real research. If we can do face-to-face interviews or video interviews, fantastic. If for some reason we can't get that time on that person's calendar to get that insights, the next best thing would be something like a survey, studying a stack of LinkedIn profiles and search footprint for that particular kind of person, and finding out, when we look at their LinkedIn profiles, we're going to get a window into how they describe themselves. We're going to get a window into how they describe their job responsibilities. And when we look at the kind of content that they share, that they interact with, that they like and comment on, the groups that they belong to, the LinkedIn groups they belong to, the skills that they're endorsed for, we start to get a picture as to what makes them tick. Then we can take the same person's name and the same person's company, and we can do a Google search, or we can do a ChatGPT search, or we can do all of the above. And we start to learn in their own words how they describe themselves and the consensus on their biggest goals and challenges. Once we have that nailed down and we can segment by the different kind of job functions that show up on that decision committee, like your mileage may vary, but common people that are showing up on these massive hyperscale deals would be like a board member, a CFO, a CEO. It used to all be the CTO. The CTO is still there, but on these huge deals, they may not be taking the lead. They may be riding shotgun. So the 3 or 4 different kinds of roles, and getting crystal clear on what they care about when it comes to hyperscale and what they're stressed out about when it comes to hyperscale. Then from there, we build out a content calendar and we build out an educational events calendar. And we set about making it known among these couple dozen, these couple hundred people that within your company, you have the smartest people on the planet for this particular job function in this region for a company this size in this particular industry. And the better job that you can do that and repeating that and demonstrating it over and over and over again, the more likely it is that you're going to get one or more people from that company that want to spend time with client-facing members of your team. So instead of you having to chase them and beg them for time on your calendar so you can come in and do a diagnostic or an exploratory or, heaven forbid, a pitch. We don't like to pitch. We're not baseball players, right? We want to be seen more as trusted technology advisors. In order to be able to do that successfully, they have to be open to letting you educate and build trust with them. And when you do this well, they start to become very receptive to when they register for your webinar or your lunch and learn, or they download your thought leadership research report. They tend to be very receptive to, hey, when it comes to hyperscale data centers, it takes a village. Typically, people from this job function like finance, IT, operations, compliance, board members, CEOs, what have you, are typically involved in this kind of process. So with that in mind, who else should read this? Who else should watch this? Who else should register for this? Who else should attend this? And you would be shocked at how often that simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 20 years now, one, how often your competitors completely overlook that. And second, how ridiculously impactful it is to getting multiple stakeholders from the same company to consume your content, to register and attend your educational events. And when you do that, it has a magical impact because you're proactively helping multiple people from that same company getting aligned on the same way of looking at hyperscale, which happens to be aligned with how your company looks at hyperscale. So long before they get to the point where they're thinking that they're in a sales process, you can start to win them over. And what's super important to take into account with all of this is we're now in a world where the self-driven buyer's journey has become the predominant buyer's journey. What does this mean? 10 years ago, if you were looking to do lead generation for hyperscale data centers, one, it was still pretty early on in the world of hyperscale data centers. But the one thing that you could count on is that people would get about halfway through their research and decision-making process, and then they would be ready to book some time with a member of your sales team. In the 2010s, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, did research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions and found that 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact. Not too bad, right? You still, if you did most things right, you got to spend 44%, the final 44% of their buyer's journey of your sales cycle with your prospects and clients. However, those days are now long, long gone. They're very much so in the rearview mirror. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, and more Gen Z, more Gen X, more millennials in decision-making roles, and millions of people working from home, tens of millions of people working from home at the beginning of the 2020s, and millions of people still continuing to work from home has drastically altered these buyer preferences. So much so that that number, that 56%, has jumped all the way to 83%. Now 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens in a self-driven buyer's journey without you in the room, meaning it's only the final 17% of research and decision-making processes that you're going to get invited into. And wow, is this catching many, many sales teams and companies completely off guard. But it doesn't have to catch you completely off guard, because when you approach this with the right mindset, it opens tremendous amounts of opportunities. Opportunities for you to get invited in early and often. Opportunities for you and your client-facing team members to be seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with hyperscale data centers for this kind of stakeholder in a specific kind of company in a certain region of a certain company size and in a certain kind of industry. And when you're able to have that topical expertise declaration, and your prospects, your future clients are motivated to spend tons of time with client-facing members of your team, you're nearly guaranteed to stay on the short list. And when you do this exceptionally well, what you tend to find is your prospects and clients keep coming back for these amazingly helpful educational experiences, which starves out the oxygen supply and the interest in spending time with your competitors. So guess what happens to your competitors' role on the shortlist? They disappear from the shortlist because you're winning over multiple stakeholders from that company. Now, the future of sales, especially for hyperscale data centers, looks a lot more like guiding your ideal clients through their buying process more than traditional selling. It looks a lot more like being a project manager. The future of being an account executive in hyperscale is a lot more like being a project manager to help your internal champion drive alignment across their own team and other teams throughout the enterprise. So it's very, very different. It's a lot more like consulting. So to the extent that your account executives are now able to have the vibe more as like big four consultants, as if they were working for PwC, EY, KPMG, Deloitte, or something like that, as opposed to just being seen like a vendor, magical things start to happen with getting buy-in, with loyalty, with stickiness, and winning over the competitive options. The flip side is if you completely ignore this and you keep doing things the way you've always done them for the past 15, 20 years, your prospects and clients are going to either completely ignore you, you're going to be invisible, or they're going to treat you like crap. And at some point, if you ignore this long enough, this is going to get all the way up to your board and your CEO. And they're going to be having these meetings like, I don't understand this. We have great people. We have great capabilities. We have a super competitive option. Yet these prospects and clients that would be a fantastic fit for us, they are treating our team members like crap. They're talking down to us, condescension. They're ghosting us. They're committing to things and then backpedaling and playing all kinds of dealing in bad faith, all of this stuff. And it largely starts because you're not building a brand for the modern digital infrastructure buyer's journey. The brand is no longer just about aesthetics. It's not just something that your creative director with a PhD in Adobe Creative Suite controls anymore. Your brand is so much more than just your fonts and your hexadecimal colors and your logo. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about your company and your team members when you're not in the room. And given that you're not in the room for the first 83% anymore, the only way you're going to earn your way back into the room is to have fantastic educational content resources and fantastic educational event experiences. If you're serious about generating qualified hyperscale data center leads, this is the future of world-class lead generation, lead nurturing, and sales cycle acceleration. If you're living in the past, it's going to be a pretty rough road ahead because going forward, these digital buyer preferences, it's not going backwards. That 83% is going to keep creeping up and up and up. And for certain pockets of digital infrastructure, it's already moved to that 100% point where some of the low-end commoditized colocation, bare metal digital infrastructure is already being purchased self-service. So we have to work extra hard to earn our way in with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So you and your team members are seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with hyperscale data centers. That's how to generate qualified hyperscale data center leads. Next question up is, what do we got? How to grow a data center cooling solutions business. How to grow a data center cooling solutions business. So the first thing to be aware of is where a cooling solutions business fits in the big picture within the digital infrastructure data center critical facilities ecosystem. So data center cooling businesses are not operators. They sell to operators. Data center cooling businesses are not technology companies, although they might partner with technology companies once in a while. What data center cooling companies really are is they live within the facilities segment of data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. They might partner with data center construction, real estate, and investors. They might partner with outsourced sales and marketing within the data center industry. But where they really, really live is they're anchored deep within the data center's facilities silo, data center facilities segment. So with that in mind, who does a data center cooling solutions business actually sell to? Typically, they're going to be in really small companies. It could be a data center manager, it could be a data center owner, a data center CEO of like an operator. More than likely, they're selling to someone either in operations or more than likely in facilities. And the larger the entity is, the more there's going to be granular job titles. The smaller the entity is, the more multiple job titles, job functions are rolled up into one. But in order to grow, we need to create awareness and we need to educate and build trust. And we need to be very, very mindful of how data center operators and data center end users, specifically in these facilities related roles, are going to navigate their journey for data center cooling solutions options and how they're ultimately going to make decisions. So let's go back to the drawing board and make sure we have the right foundation here. For starters, we're going to zoom into the case study section of your website, the logos on your website, and let's figure out where you win most often. We could also look in your CRM and your customer relationship management system and do a basic win-loss analysis and try to figure out where you win most often. This is critical because the first thing we need to do as part of developing a growth plan, growth strategy, go-to-market strategy, is we need to get crystal clear on what kinds of companies are best suited to purchase and be ecstatically thrilled with the value that they're getting from your data center cooling solutions. So within your ideal client profile, where are these companies located? If you have capabilities to be able to sell to any corner of the planet and market to any corner of the planet and service those cooling solutions in any particular corner of the planet, you're in rare earth. You're in a rare place that you have big enough capabilities in all corners of the planet to be able to do that. For most companies that provide cooling solutions, they're going to, by virtue of where they have sales and services capabilities, going to narrow down the geographic part of their ideal client profile. Usually it's a particular region of the world. Usually it's a particular continent or a group of countries or a single country. And a lot of this will depend on where you have full-time employees that can represent your company in these capabilities, and or where you have channel partners, where you have integrators, where you have consultancies, where you have MEP, whoever you're partnering with on these kinds of initiatives, where you have coverage, both from a marketing and sales capability, as well as an installation and ongoing maintenance and service capability for these cooling solutions. Because in a perfect world, sure, it's set it and forget it, but the reality is, are there really any cooling solutions that are truly set it and forget it? There can be some automation, there can be some monitoring, but the reality is we're talking about items that almost certainly at some point are going to need scheduled maintenance, proactive maintenance, and going to need some repairs and upgrades. So having a physical presence there, incredibly important. After we figure out geographically where we can best market, sell, maintain, service, install these cooling solutions, how big or how small is your ideal client? In other words, how big does this data center operator, this data center end user need to be to be able to afford your minimum entry point on your data center cooling solutions? Is it at 10 employees? Is it at 50 employees? Is it at 200 employees? Is it at 500 employees? Your product manager likely knows this. Your chief revenue officer, your CEO likely knows this, but let's get clarity on how big they need to be able to hit your entry-level solution. And at the other extreme, are there certain enterprises, whether they're enterprise operators or enterprises with their own data centers, are there certain enterprises that are so overwhelmingly large that it's just not a fit for your company's current capabilities? So let's be self-aware about both of those extremes. And in the company size portion of your ideal client profile, let's get realistic about who's big enough, but not so large. Could almost think of it like Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. So what's that range in terms of headcount, in terms of number of employees? Third, are there certain industries that are an especially good fit for this? Obviously, data center operators operate at the intersection of like IT services, infrastructure. Even if you look at a couple dozen or a couple hundred data center operators and you look at their self-chosen category for the LinkedIn category, you'll likely see even 3 or 4 different answers that are there. But when you get outside of the data center operators and you look at end users with their own data centers who may have a very strong need for your data center cooling, what industries do they tend to be in? In other words, not only where there's strong interest from a marketing and sales perspective, but where they're going to be the happiest with your current capabilities, where they're going to retain, where you're going to be able to cross-sell, upsell to their other locations, where they're going to be a great source of future referrals, gladly participate in a case study. Taking all of that into account, what industries, what business models, what verticals tend to be a great fit for you beyond just data center operators. And then in this particular context of the sweet spot for certain locations, especially certain sizes, who are the stakeholders on these decision committees that you usually work with both pre and post sales? And as I mentioned at the start of this question, it's more than likely facilities engineers. It could be something having to do with HVAC. It could be something having to do with cooling. You could be partnering with someone who's literally in their job title has to do with immersion or liquid or something like this. At this stage of the game, it could be chillers, C-racks in the old days. There's a bunch of different job titles that they can conceivably have. What we're looking for is the consensus on the job titles and the job functions that pop up most often with your most satisfied, most profitable clients that give you strong consensus that this is the most important economic decision maker, most important economic stakeholder that you come into contact with, because we're going to designate that kind of person as your primary buyer persona. More than likely, if you're selling to large accounts, there's usually a second category of stakeholder that gets involved beyond the obvious one. And you'll know this because if you look back in your CRM and you talk to your longtime members of your sales team, your account executives, your account managers, they'll know like kind of who are the people that are typically involved and what are their job titles, what are their job functions, their particular departments. So I want you at the minimum to have a primary and a secondary buyer persona, because we need to go deep on their true motivations. This is something for sure that your product manager would spend time on, but from purely a sales, marketing, go-to-market strategy standpoint, we need to know the answers to this as well. So let's say, for example, we're dealing with a data center manager and a data center facilities manager as two distinctly different kinds of roles that are involved in this process. In smaller companies, we're probably splitting hairs. In larger companies, maybe there's truly a difference. So we need to either through face-to-face interviews or video interviews, or at the absolute minimum, do surveys, studying their CRM records, looking at a stack of relevant LinkedIn profiles, taking the same first, last job titles and putting them in a Google search or an LLM search or something like that. We need to get in their own words what their biggest goals are when it comes to the intersection of data center cooling and what else is going on in their professional lives, and what their biggest struggles are, what their biggest challenges are, what their biggest stressors are when it comes to data center cooling and other relevant related areas in and around their professional lives. Once we get the consensus on those in their own words and we're able to rank them, we're in a fantastic position to use that information to rethink how we present ourselves on our website. This will for sure impact product marketing, sales enablement, lead generation, sales cycle acceleration, your content calendar, and your educational events calendar. Because once you know what their biggest goals are and what's driving them nuts, then you can set about delivering immense amounts of value that motivate those folks to want to spend significant amounts of their research and decision making with client-facing members of your team. So instead of you having to chase them and beg for meetings and manipulate and do whatever you're trying to do to get these meetings, you totally turn this around to the point where they actually are motivated to want to spend time with your account executives, your account managers, your product managers, your solutions architect, your solutions engineers, your chief innovation officer, whoever is involved in being able to deliver value to this particular kind of stakeholder in this kind of company in an educational context. And when you do that, it has a game-changing impact in your company earning your way in to be there for as many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision as possible. Ooh, what did I just drop in there? 28 touch points. Yes, this is an enormous problem in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, because the default playbook that so many companies are still using for growth invests an absurdly high percentage in paid events, paid media, massive global and national conferences, and they certainly have their place. And for sure, if you're very selective on looking at the prospectus on who attended last year and who's projected to attend this year, and that happens to align up pretty well with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas, keep doing what you've always been doing. Just keep improving it over time so you're seen more as an expert as opposed to a vendor. However, if you've been going to same conferences year after year and you pull out your ideal client profile and you pull out your prioritized buyer personas on the right-hand side of the screen and on the left-hand side of the screen, you're looking at the media kit from this conference and they're telling you who attended last year and who's anticipated to be attending this year, and it doesn't line up especially well, the needle in the haystack may be exactly what you think it is, a needle in a haystack. And with that in mind, you may be over-investing in one or two touch points and spending a disproportionately unsustainable percentage of your growth budget on one or two touch points and leaving nothing left for the other 26 touch points. In other words, you could be at a perfect conference that lines up really, really well with your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas. And you can be the main sponsor of this amazing celebrity fundraising golf tournament. And you could also knock it out of the park with sponsoring this amazing cabana party poolside at this palatial resort where the conference is being held. But just understand, those are two touch points out of 28 that this individual is going to navigate between complete stranger and purchase decision. Yes, they tend to be weighted a little more, but there's still 26 other touch points. So unless you have an extremely bizarre prospect or client who's going to sit on their hands for 362 days until they see you again at next year's event, you need a proactive strategy and educational strategy for staying in front of them, because just bugging them every 2 or 3 weeks, are you ready to meet yet? When can we meet yet? When can we meet? How come we're not meeting yet? When can I come in? When can I demo? Like, it doesn't work anymore. It didn't work 10 years ago, but now it really, really doesn't work, because the search engines, the social media, the review websites, the podcasts, the YouTube videos, the webinars, that's where the attention is. And in order for us to be effective at earning our way back in to grow this data center cooling solutions business, it's not enough for us to be seen as a really cool, credible vendor who wins these awards, who has this amazing booth presence, who put on this fantastic cabana party or golf tournament. They need to see, the most important stakeholders on these decision committees need to see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center cooling for their particular job, for a company in their region, in their particular industry, at their particular size. So much to the point that they're spending nearly all of their professional development time with members of your client-facing team, meaning they're literally starving the attention and the oxygen away from your competitors. That's how, when it comes to growing your cooling business, that's how you stay on the short list throughout the full buyer's journey, with showing up early and often. It's not enough to just show up once. You need to be in on as many of those 28 touch points as possible, early and often. But that's also how you get your competition kicked off the short list, because there's no time or interest left in your most important stakeholders spending time with people from other companies, because they're learning a ridiculous amount about how to do their job better from your client-facing team members. And that's the key to all of this, is to get out of the vendor box by being seen as the expert, the educator, the consultant, the trusted advisor. And some of the more senior members of your team may even be seen as thought leaders. That's what you should be thinking about. That's the playbook for growing a data center cooling solutions business in a self-driven buyer's journey to modern buyers who actually exist in today's marketplace, not that fictionally or wishful thinking exists. Look, I'm on the young end of Gen X, and everyone that I know that still works part-time or full-time in the data center industry, critical facilities or digital infrastructure, that's a baby boomer. And at this stage of the game, most of the baby boomers that are still active in this industry, some of them are working full-time, a lot of them are working part-time as advisors, but in nearly every single case, they're very comfortable on LinkedIn. They're very comfortable attending webinars and speaking at webinars. They're very comfortable watching YouTube videos and podcasts and appearing on guests as other people's podcasts. So when you come up with this playbook that invests in such a way that you believe that there's all of these digital resistors out there who are somehow the internal champion of a major initiative around data center cooling, who the heck do you think you're marketing to? You have like a buyer persona that retired 25 years ago that's like pushing 100 years old that is still clinging to this decision making role with their fax modem and their BlackBerry, waiting for the trade publication to come in the mail so they can look at the back and see what vendors have interesting solutions. I don't know who you think you're marketing to. So when you get clarity on your ideal client profile, when you get clarity on your buyer personas, when you truly understand what their biggest goals are, what their biggest struggles are when it comes to data center cooling, your mission needs to be showing up in a way that there is no question whatsoever that among these stakeholders, your company doesn't just have the dominant position as a vendor, that you have the predominant position in the industry because you have the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center cooling. So what's our next question? Let's take a quick look at, we got a comment here. Oh, cool. From the UK, we sell or lease single tenant data centers. Terrific. Yeah, for sure. You're in the right place. Crowded space. So being able to improve your competitive positioning, arrive earlier in the sales journey, be seen as a thought leader, get the sales cycle acceleration right, and build a scalable revenue growth engine is especially important for single location, single data centers where there's often a pretty thin bench of resources to deploy into marketing, sales, and go to market. So it's really, really important to work as smart as possible and to use that expertise as a differentiator. So next big question up that we're going to tackle today is, how do we improve data center power solutions branding? How do we improve data center power solutions branding? So yeah, power is a really, really big deal right now. In case you've been on vacation for the last 5 years, in nearly every region of the world, power consumption for data centers is now somewhere between scarcity to regulated to activists showing up at conferences and wanting to basically shut down your industry, because in some countries around the world, data center power consumption has now reached the 10% or even more than 10% point of available grid capacity. And we know that with that in mind, especially with the hockey stick growth that's going on with AI and high performance computing and supercomputing, it's just not sustainable. So there's a ton of creative solutions that are being put into place now around sustainability, on different kinds of cooling, on efficiency, and alternate grid power sources. So you're looking to improve your data center power solutions branding. What should you be thinking about? Let's get really specific on who we're improving this branding for, but let's also take a step back and make sure we're on the same page about branding. 10 years ago, it was possible for your branding to be run by a creative director. This was the person that super hip, super cool, thought they were way cooler than everyone else in your company. They wore a beret to work. They talked with a funny accent, and they really, really had this air of superiority about them. It was very much an artistic kind of thing. They probably had a PhD in Adobe Creative Suite. And for sure, the aesthetics and the creative director have an even more important role today in a self-driven buyer's journey. And it's not just about your images. It's about that creative person also infusing your brand into video assets. Video is incredibly important. But make no mistake, your branding shouldn't be 100% controlled by a creative director anymore, because it's really changed. Your brand is about so much more than just the fonts and the hexadecimal colors and the logos. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace, that the industry says about your company and your team members when you're not in the room. And given that you're hardly in the room for much of the buyer's journey anymore in a self-driven buyer's journey, this has become a really big challenge. 10 years ago, you would be in the room with your prospects and clients for like half of their research and decision-making process. At the time in the 2010s, CEB, corporate executive board that's now part of Gartner, found that 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact, before vendor contact. So it was 56% over, but you still were in there for the final 44%. That number has jumped all the way to 83%, meaning that even if you do everything perfectly, you're only getting in there for the final 17% of the buyer's journey with your traditional marketing and sales playbook. So if we want to improve your data center power solutions branding, we have to recognize that your creative director and the aesthetics are just part of the puzzle now. In order for us to earn our way back in and get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box, our client-facing team members need to be seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center power solutions for a specific geographic region, for companies of a certain size, for companies of a certain industry, and for specific kind of stakeholders that you do best at educating and building trust with. And to the extent that you're able to do this, what you're going to find that a lot of building a brand is proactively anticipating what the most important stakeholders want to know and being the preferred source of education and training and learning. So when it comes to figuring out, like in the case of data center power solutions, it's probably a facilities executive. It could be an infrastructure person. It could be an MEP person. It could be a ESG executive. There's a number of people that get involved, and it could be construction that get involved in caring about power solutions in and around data centers. So we need to figure out for your particular business model, for your addressable, your reachable market, who are the people that matter most, that have the biggest economic impact on your sales process and how onboarding and retention and expansion and turning clients into promoters, what works out best. And as long as your company is well established, you should have some pretty good answers to that. Which economic stakeholder matters most? That person will be designated your primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of stakeholder we'll call your secondary buyer persona. And that's a huge part of getting the branding right, is going and figuring out who has the most impact, what's going on in their world, and how you can help the best, how you can educate and build trust the best at the intersection of your expertise and what they care the most about. So doing the customer insight research, doing the buyer persona research, and getting in their own words what their biggest goals are around data center power are incredibly important. What their biggest struggles are, what their biggest challenges are around data center power. Not what we think those goals and challenges are, but what the challenges actually are in their own words. And when we get the consensus on that of how they articulate their biggest data center power goals as individuals, as their team, as part of their team, as part of the whole company, and their biggest struggles or stressors, what's driving them the most nuts about their existing data center power challenges. When we get the consensus on their own words and we can rank them, we know exactly what we need to do with website copywriting, with product marketing, with sales enablement, with our educational resources, with our email nurturing, with our social posts, with our digital ads, and perhaps most of all, with our educational events. Because we want to provide so much value that your prospects and clients want to spend a lot of time with your company. And the better job we can do with that, the more we can educate and build trust with them at the stage where they're still open to learning, long before the vendor resistance goes up at that 83% point. So if you think of 28 touch points from awareness to consideration and from consideration to decision, our goal for the most part is to use these educational events experiences to encourage the most important people to want to spend a significant amount of time with your team members. And when that happens, not only will they come over and over and over again to keep learning, but they'll start bringing their coworkers with them. They'll start bringing their boss with them, other members of the decision committee. And when that happens, when you start to look down at your email registrations, confirmations, or you look down at what Eventbrite or Zoom or HubSpot or wherever else you're capturing on this, and you see like, wow, in the last hour, 5 people from the same company registered. I think they're all from the same team. That's amazing. They're talking about us. That's awesome. We have a really, really special opportunity to be able to educate and build trust with those folks when they're at the stage where they're open to learning from our experts and how we see this category, how we see data center power, and our frame, how they're evaluating all the competitive options that are in front of them, the alternative options that are in front of them long before they get to the decision stage and the sales resistance goes way, way up. So that's how I would approach how to improve data center power solutions branding is be very client-centric, get out of the vendor box, make significant investments, change your company culture so you're able to stay out of the vendor box, which mostly aligns with getting really deep dive into what the most important stakeholders care about and how you can show up early and often for the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context. So they see you and your client facing team members as the be all end all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center power solutions for a company that size in that particular location for that kind of business, for that kind of role, for that kind of industry. So it's hyper specialized for who they are and what they care about, and how we can become the preferred destination for learning and facilitating these great conversations and learning across multiple stakeholders from the same company. We're going to take a quick break for a message from our sponsor. If you've been getting great value so far from today's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button, and we'll be right back.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you are watching this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. If you have a question, if you have a topic that you think that we ought to address in one of our upcoming shows, make sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching on, and we'll consider adding it to a queue for one of our upcoming episodes. So next question up is, how do we access colocation data center decision makers? How do we access decision makers for colocation data centers? So there's a couple possibilities here, and I think we need to get crystal clear on whether your company sells colocation and you're trying to get access to decision makers like IT leaders or infrastructure leaders in end user companies or other colocation facilities, or whether you're actually a data center technology company or data center facilities company and you want to sell to colocation data center providers. From the way this question is phrased, it's not totally clear which decision makers you're looking for. Are you looking for decision makers who work for a colocation provider, which, depending on the company size, could be on a single location colocation data center, could even be a CEO or CTO. On a massive colocation operator, unless you're selling a huge strategically important initiative, you're probably dealing with someone who's more like mid-level or director level or VP level. So are you selling to the colocation data center, or are you the colocation data center and you're selling to end users? We're going to go with the second scenario here, is that you are part of a colocation data center and you're looking for end user decision makers that want to rent space, that want to lease space in your colocation facility. So with that in mind, a lot depends on whether you're a single location colocation operator or a multi-location colocation operator. The reason that this matters so much is single location colocation operators have unique challenges because they're so resource constrained. You really have to be especially crisp on picking your battles on where you can win most often, because at the end of the day, for a colocation operator, you really do need two different kinds of playbooks. You need a playbook for potential clients, potential decision makers that are hyper local, that are able to drive that are able to get to your facility within 30 to 60 minutes. That's one particular playbook. And that playbook, in almost all cases, is going to be centered around getting FaceTime, not Apple FaceTime, but actual visits to your facility by the decision makers and other stakeholders on that decision committee. And typically the playbook that most colocation operators, colocation data centers gravitate around is events. And it could be other people's events where you're using that as a funnel or a magnet to get people to visit your facility. Or in a more ideal scenario, I'd recommend actually hosting educational events at your facility on a regular basis. So if you have a classroom that can hold, doesn't have to be huge, you could hold 10, 15, 20 people, and you have the groundwork for that. If you have a conference room that can hold 10, 15, 20 people, or even a foyer where you can set up chairs for a 2 or 3 hour, 1 hour, 90-minute, whatever, breakfast seminar, or lunch and learn, or something like that, where you're pairing education with a site tour. This is the playbook for high value decision makers to educate and build trust with these folks. So if your company has been around a while, you likely have defined your ideal client profile. Where geographically these folks should be located, again, hyper-local, probably is within a 30 or 60-minute radius of your location. Company sizes, where do you win most often? If you're a single location co-location provider, get realistic on what size is too big, where you're going to get knocked out because they're looking for something that's multi-location or several location, or maybe even multinational. And at what size is an end user client too small to be able to afford your minimum? So let's get to a point where you know your range of like the smallest size company and the largest size company that would be a good fit for buying colocation from your company. And are there certain industries where you can win, and there's certain industries where you're not going to win? And this is important because depending on where you're located, there may be compliance issues, certification issues, accreditation issues that come up both nationally, regionally, statewide, whatever it is, either across all different kinds of businesses or across specific kinds of businesses like healthcare, education, government, e-commerce, what have you. So you either have the ability to be able to sell co-location to those kind of companies. If so, that's an inclusion that you want to specifically mention in your ideal client profile. If you don't have the capability, that's an exclusion that you want to specifically mention in your ideal client profile. Because when it comes to like outbound prospecting, when it comes to LinkedIn ads, when it comes to the drop-down lists on your web forms, when it comes to the pages and the navigation on your website, these for sure are issues that you want to address proactively. And then in those particular companies, who are when you look at the muscle memory of your case studies, your logos, your CRM, where you've won most often, where you've had the most success most often, who was involved pre-sales and post-sales in that particular account? That will help you to figure out who the most important and second most important stakeholder decision maker is that you want to be educating and building trust with for your company's co-location data centers. So as long as you're pretty crisp on your ideal client profile, and as long as you're pretty crisp on your prioritized buyer persona, especially as a single location data center, you can flesh out and say, yeah, there's 3 different kinds of stakeholders. But I'm going to tell you that if your resources are really limited and you don't have a significant sized marketing sales enablement team, just focus on the most important one for now. The others, for sure, have them as a drop-down list on your form, build out a website page. But in terms of building out like an educational events calendar where you have one event a month for the next 12 months or one event a quarter for the next 4 quarters, just focus on the most important kind of decision maker. And once you've done that, do your actual buyer persona research so you know in their own words their biggest goals and their biggest challenges when it comes to anything and everything having to do with co-location data centers. How do you get that information? Face-to-face interviews can be awesome. Video interviews are still pretty good. If you can't get access to that, either a survey looking in your CRM or studying a stack of 10, 15, 20 LinkedIn profiles and search results for that particular person, for that particular decision maker in that kind of company. And what we're looking to do is get the consensus on their biggest professional goals that are at least somewhat relevant to co-location data centers and digital infrastructure, and what they're struggling most with in their business when it comes to IT and digital infrastructure and data centers. And once you have the consensus on that, on their own words, it's a lot easier to come up with that educational events calendar of like the 12 topics or the 4 topics that you want to cover over the next year with those folks. So that drives your topics, that drives your copywriting, that drives your outline, that drives your bullet points. And then you set up your landing page, you create your invitations on your website, you set up your email marketing, you go to your CRM. Presumably, you already have a list of the companies and the individuals that are your targets, that are your ideal clients, that are these decision makers. If not, take time to build out that company list, take time to figure out who the decision makers are, populate that information and your CRM, who are the couple dozen or the few hundred or the few thousand potential decision makers at these companies that would share these goals, that would share these challenges, that would get a lot of value from attending an educational event at your co-location facility. And give yourself enough lead time and invite them. The cool part is if you've done other people's events, yes, that's more work to do everything from start to finish, but you can invite exactly who you want to. You can set the exact perfect date and time. You can set the exact environment, the exact context. There's no one filtering your message, and you solely are responsible for the educational value that you provide to that individual. And oh yeah, as a side bonus, instead of spending tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands traveling to these national and global conferences, you can put on these events in your own facility for, I don't want to say almost nothing, but if you're inviting 30 people for breakfast, realistically, what does it cost to get bagels and pastries and coffee? If you're inviting 20 or 30 people to a lunch and learn, realistically, what does it cost to bring in some catering? Sandwiches, pizza, whatever, whatever you think is appropriate there. I can tell you without a doubt, it is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what it costs to have a significant presence at a national or global conference. Even locally, if you were to go host an educational event in a restaurant or a hotel or a convention center, your ability to host this in your own facility, I've literally seen companies in data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities move their offices to be to the point where they have a nice sized classroom that accommodates comfortably 20, 30, 40 people, because this is such an important part of their growth engine. Now, obviously, if you're just holding 4 events a year, it's not going to get crazy onerous, the difference between holding this in someone else's facility versus yours, but it's definitely a point of friction for getting the folks there from the educational event to take the tour. But if you want to be able to really double down on this, if you have 2 or 3 different buyer personas and you want to do this once a month, every other week or something like that, this can be a fantastic, fantastic playbook for accessing decision makers. Because even if you're getting originally someone fairly junior showing interest from this company, these kinds of educational events experiences are extremely conducive to when someone registers, getting back the automated email that says, "We're so glad that you registered for our upcoming lunch and learn on 10 cybersecurity best practices that everyone needs to be thinking about for their for their IT infrastructure or for co-location data centers," whatever it is, whatever you think is relevant for this particular stakeholder. But we know it takes a village. Typically, there's people involved from network operations, from cybersecurity, from IT support, from CTO, from compliance, whatever, that are super interested in this topic. So with that in mind, who else from your company should also attend? And be amazed how well that simple question of who else should attend works. And you don't need it to work for a huge percentage of the time to have a magical impact on the success of your educational events, to see like, wow, 2 people from the same company are coming. That's pretty good. Next time, when you invite people, that same list, there's 6 people from the same company they're coming. 6 people. That could be like the entire decision committee. And they see you and your team members as the be-all end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with their topics and learning about what's relevant, what's top of mind, what's driving people nuts when it comes to co-location data centers. So that's the magical way to access decision makers for co-location data centers, is educational events. Now, if the people that you're targeting aren't local, it's largely the same playbook. It could even be the same slides, the same educational content, except instead of delivering it in your classroom or conference room, you're delivering it on Zoom, on GoToWebinar, on On24, on Goldcast, whatever you're using, on streaming, because you're delivering this to a long distance audience who's looking at your co-location, not because they're hyper local, but because they need something in your location for edge reasons, for governance reasons, for latency reasons, whatever it is. And they're specifically looking for space in your kind of location. So it's the same kind of playbook, except you're running it digitally, you're running it virtually. So you need a target account list. You need to know who the decision makers are. You need an email database. You need lead time to be able to invite them, except instead of coupling that with breakfast and lunch or networking or mingling time or a tour, you have to be a little more creative. So immediately following the educational component, you could literally have a virtual tour where you're walking someone through in a live fashion and being able to take questions. There's a lot of different, or you're just doing the same kind of on-demand thing that's likely on your website already. But for sure, for colocation data centers, reaching decision makers, in most cases, you're going to want to have a brick and mortar kind of playbook for people that are local enough to be able to attend events in person. And then you want to have a digital playbook for people that are long distance, that are across the country, across the globe, that are specifically looking for colocation in your area, that may never even end up touring your facility and end up making a purchase decision based on what they can learn. So that's where the educational events, the educational experience demonstrating your expertise is incredibly impactful for accessing colocation data center decision makers. Now, the larger your organization gets, the more this goes from a nice to have to a must have to be able to compete with more sophisticated options that are in front of them. But typically, for small local colocation operators, when companies are choosing you, they're choosing you because they love the idea of a locally owned business. And when things go wrong, being able to get direct access to the CEO and the longevity and the community participation. Once you get beyond that, there's 3 or 4 different levels of growth between the single location, co-location operator, infrastructure operator, all the way up to like the digital realties and the Equinixes and the NTTs and companies that are operating at that kind of level. In between there, you have the multi-location that's independently owned. We have 2, 3, 4 locations in the same area. Then you get into double digits, typically 10, 30, 40 locations. That's where you almost always start to see venture-backed or private equity companies. And then you get into the larger versions of theirs, where it's really a lot more about being a real estate investment trust than being in the co-location business. And at that size, usually you see it's either private equity or publicly traded or something. But the playbooks change quite dramatically when it comes to accessing decision makers when you have a well-known brand to be able to lean on versus where you're actually using the education and the subject matter expertise to build the brand. So those are some things to be thinking about when it comes to accessing colocation data center decision makers, depending on your context. And again, in this example, it's a colocation data center that's looking to sell space, rack and cabinet space in their colocation facility. There's another context where you're a technology or facilities company and you're looking to sell to colocation data centers. Same basic idea. We need to define your ideal client profile. We need to figure out which buyer personas matter the most. We need to drill into what goals and challenges are top of mind for each of those kinds of stakeholders. And then we need to set out with creating amazingly impactful educational resources and educational events that motivate those stakeholders, that motivate those decision makers to want to spend nearly all of their professional development learning time with client-facing members of your team. So over time, they come to realize that your client-facing team members are some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with co-location data centers and their particular job role in a particular geographic region for a certain company size in their particular industry. And naturally, the more fine-tuned the more precise you are about who you're creating this content for, the more it is to resonate. At some point, it could be so finely tuned that you may be limiting your audience, but just recognize that you're trying to capture someone's attention that's scrolling by. Imagine you're trying to literally grab them by the shirt collars as they're scrolling by on LinkedIn or YouTube or on a search results page or something like that. And the more hyper relevant it is for who they are and what they care about, the more likely there is that wow, they have exactly what I'm looking for. I've been looking for something just like this for weeks, for days, for months. I can't believe I finally found this. Who are these people? And what else do they have to say? And that's when they start to be receptive to, oh, there's a lunch and learn on this next Thursday. There's a webinar on this next month. There's a special report. There's a planning guide. There's a template. For sure, I'll trade my business card for what's on the other side of the landing page, because the value proposition is just so outrageously specific to who I am and what I care about that I can't help but want to learn more with this team. So next question, how do we develop a strong modular data center brand? How do we develop a strong brand for modular data centers? For those of you that don't know what a modular data center is, it's basically a self-contained data center in a container that's manufactured in a factory and transported to a specific location to basically be hooked up to telecommunications and power, water if needed, and is ready to go. So it shortcuts months, even years of construction, and it's able to deploy in the time that it ships and getting set up, you're able to shave years down to like a day or two. So it's fantastic for edge. It's fantastic for temporary. It's fantastic for disaster recovery areas. And it's a really, really booming area. Interestingly enough, there actually are some contexts where people take wholesale data center halls and put modular facilities in there. I first got to see this, must have been back in like, I think fall of 2016. I went out to Phoenix, and it was IO Data Centers that's now part of Iron Mountain. And they had the sister company. I think it was actually two brothers that were the founders, and IO was one that had multi-locations at that point. And Base Layer was manufacturing modular facilities. So I remember going to see the factory and simultaneously going to see the facility. And I thought it was really, really interesting that in addition to the modular data centers being sent down on a standalone basis, you have this great idea where these pods internally within a wholesale facility can get deployed so much better. And it's like so much faster. And it's like a self-contained suite for certain kind of clients that want to own a much more significant part of that particular facility. So the question and the demand for this has only grown tremendously in recent years. And again, it's fantastic for edge. It's fantastic for governance. It's fantastic for disaster recovery, for flexibility. And I'm sure people that do marketing and sales for modular data centers all day long can rattle off another 5 or 10 really compelling benefits beyond that. But in terms of developing a strong brand in and around modular data centers, I would approach the go-to-market for this. I would approach the sales and marketing strategy for this much the way that I would approach at the intersection. Modular is interesting because you're empowering, you're giving a turnkey solution for someone that's a data center operator. But there's for sure pieces of it inside that are relevant for data center technology. And there's pieces of it inside that are relevant for data center facilities. And it's useful because they can be plugged in within a wholesale facility, like on the construction side or real estate side. And it's great from an investment. So, it's truly multidisciplined. So at the end of the day, what you really have to decide is, for building the strong modular data center brand, who's the primary client that you really want to sell these modular data centers to? Are you trying to sell them to operators? Are you trying to sell them to end users? Are you trying to sell them to data center developers? Are you selling them to data center technology executives, facilities executives? At some point, you kind of have to look at the case studies, the logos, your CRM, and figure out where you've been most successful so far. Who's typically involved, pre-sales, post-sales? What gives you the smoothest sales process, the most profitable engagement? What provides the most value for the client? Where do they get the smoothest onboarding? It's weird. There's kind of, would you call it commissioning? It's more like installing, because a lot of the commissioning is being done in a prefab setting back at the factory to speed up this whole process. But there's potentially 10 or 15 different kinds of companies in and around data center critical facilities and digital infrastructure that you could conceivably want to build your brand in front of. And some of them would be direct end user customers. A lot of them would be channel partners, like integrators, for example, that don't necessarily specialize in modular data centers, but could be fantastic for helping to bring you in and connect the dots for a client that needs this kind of capability. Along the same lines, consulting firms, maybe design build firms take into account that inside of a facility they're building, that there be modular data centers. So it's really, really hard to go in 10, 15, 20 different directions at once, even if you have pretty significant resources. So what I would encourage you to do is to look at where you've won the best and where your clients have achieved the most success, and use that to tighten up your ideal client profile. What's the geographic region where you can market, sell, and service these modular data centers the best? What are the company sizes where they're big enough to afford your minimums, but not so large that you're outmatched by more sophisticated competitors, or the clients have more demanding needs? And are there certain industries that are more conducive than others, in addition to the operators? Like, are there certain industries like healthcare, government, manufacturing, whatever, telecommunications, that are more conducive than others? And then within these companies, who is typically involved pre and post sales that has the biggest impact on your success with that particular account? Because once you're able to know who the individual stakeholders are and prioritize who has the biggest economic impact, then you can set about doing the research on what's top of mind for each of those, which for sure for a product manager or chief product officer is incredibly important. From a marketing, sales, go-to-market playbook standpoint, it's really super important as well to get the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest challenges when it comes to the intersection of what you do as a manufacturer, as a builder of modular data center solutions. So get it in their own words, prioritize what those words actually are, and then those words need to be all over your website. They need to be in your product marketing. They need to be in your sales enablement. They need to be in your email templates, in your email marketing, in your social posts, in your ads. And most of all, if you're looking to build an educational event strategy as a big part of your brand, they for sure need to be in the titles and the copywriting and the calls to action with your virtual events and your physical events. But again, we're not going to guess on those words. We're going to figure out what those words actually are, because we're going to talk to the stakeholders either in person or we're going to set up Zoom calls, or we're going to, if we can't do that, we're going to do surveys. We're going to look at their LinkedIn profile. We're going to look at when they're quoted in blogs and speak at conferences, what they say, how they describe themselves. LinkedIn is fantastic for this, but we need to get that consensus, because once we're able to get that consensus, it becomes a lot easier to have the relevancy that we need to build a strong modular data center brand. And the smaller your company is, the more critical it is that you use these educational experiences, these educational events to flip the switch. So instead of being seen as a vendor of modular data centers, you're seen as the be-all, end-all experts on modular data centers, subject matter experts, teachers, consultants, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. And the way you can, as a smaller company, the way you can win against huge companies is to go at this one little segment, one little niche at a time. So when you're creating these content resources, when you're creating these educational events, it's for a specific kind of stakeholder on a decision committee in a specific geographic region. Needless to say, like if you're marketing to a modular data center decision maker in Germany, you're probably going to use a different language than if you're marketing to a data center, a modular data center decision maker in France or Spain or the US. Different language, different localization needs, different content needs. So get specific about the geographic region. Get specific about the company sizes, what's big enough to afford your minimums, but not so large that you're outmatched or the cycle is just too long, and what industries you can win the most on because of their compliance issues, accreditation issues that you either can cover or can't cover. But from a standpoint of modular data centers, there's going to be a very practical consideration. It's not just the marketing and selling. It's where you can manufacture and actually cost effectively deliver and maintain and service these modular data centers over time. So all of that needs to be taken into account when it comes to developing a strong modular data center brand. But just recognize the brand is a lot more than just the logos, the color chart, and the hexadecimal colors. Your brand is what people say about your company and your client-facing team members when they're not in the room. And given that you're not in the room anymore from the most of the self-driven buyer's journey, it's incredibly important that you use these educational resources, these educational experiences to get invited in to their side of the table where you still have a chance to impact the journey in the early and the middle stages and the awareness and consideration stages of their journey, where you can teach them about what they need to know about how others in similar companies and similar roles in their particular region have navigated this research and decision-making process around anything and everything having to do with modular data centers. So that's the playbook that I would use going forward. I skewed it a little more on the small to mid-size kind of modular data center provider, because typically, if you're building this at the size of, if you at an enterprise, you probably don't need a ton of help on the I don't know, maybe you do need some help on the go-to-market strategy, but I think that the kind of person that's coming to us and asking this kind of question is looking at this more as trying to disrupt some of the incumbents and 800-pound gorillas in this space, and being smart, being creative, and using these educational experiences, using these educational events is a huge part of being able to do this. Obviously, at some point, you're going to want someone to walk through one of your modular data center facilities. So if you don't have one in the area, you're going to need to move these around and figure out creative ways to be able to align that educational experience with that part of that as well. But yeah, for sure, this is what I would be thinking about if you're looking to develop a strong modular data center brand in and around the space. So as we're heading down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, if you've gotten great value so far from what we've talked about today, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic that you think that we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments as well. Enjoying this live. Thank you. Thanks for answering. I agree with you. are we building AI data centers? No, I'm not personally building AI data centers, but we get a lot of people that come to us that are building AI data centers that we do consulting with. So if you're curious about how that works, feel free to send me a connect request on LinkedIn, mention that you attended or watched the data center sales and marketing Q&A show, and we can look at whether there's a potential to work together on that. So that brings us to our final question that I'm going to be tackling today is, how do we simplify the edge data center sales process? How do we simplify the edge data center sales process? That's a fantastic question. And I think a lot of edge data centers are struggling with the exact kind of issue of what edge actually means. Because there's a certain scenario 5 years ago where edge and modular were kind of joined at the hip. But what I also see now is a lot of legacy colocation facilities that aren't able to take high density workloads like AI workloads also have a very bright future for people that have more traditional workloads that don't need the density, but really value the location, the very precise nature of their location for latency reasons, for governance reasons, whatever it is, disaster recovery reasons. So how do we simplify the edge data center sales processes? We need to get super specific about where we can win. If you have a chief revenue officer, if you have a chief product officer, they likely spend a lot of time talking about this exact issue. Coming in from an outsider perspective, I would want to look at your logos. I would want to look at your case studies. I'd want to have you pull up CRM and look at your last 10 or 20 deals that you've closed and look and see what these companies have in common. Are they all located in a certain geographic region? Are they all within a certain tight band of company sizes? Do they tend to be within the same kind of industries? I need to see if there's consensus around that, because the consensus around that is a huge part of being able to simplify your sales process. If you're all over the place, if you're selling in 14 different geographic regions, if you're having to market and sell in 8 different languages, and you're leaning heavily on employees, marketing and sales team members all over the globe and channel partners all over the globe, that's really, really complex for a really small company. If you're looking to simplify your edge data center sales process, we need to get really tight about who the ideal client is. In other words, where they're located, their company size, what's big enough to afford your minimums for leasing space in your edge data center, but not so large that you'd be outmatched by more sophisticated competitors. Are there certain industries that are especially good fit because you have certain compliance and certification and accreditation requirements for your particular area that you either have or don't have? And then when it comes to the sales process, we should also get specific, not just about the companies, but the individuals that have had the most success, where you've had the most success with education and trust building with these folks pre-sales and having a smooth onboarding and account management process going forward. That makes an enormous, enormous difference. Because when we're that specific about who they are, both from a company perspective and an individual perspective, we can go do our buyer persona research and get consensus on their biggest goals and challenges. And we can try to follow the popcorn trail throughout the full buyer's journey, from awareness to consideration and consideration to decision, to uncover and reverse engineer those 28 steps that they take between complete stranger and purchase decision. For product managers, they often talk about like a job to be done kind of framework, and that would support the same kind of initiative of getting really deep into understanding your prospects and clients' true motivations for buying edge data center services, renting edge data center space from your particular company. And to the extent that you're able to see strong consensus on this, this is where you can start to have much better alignment on your website copywriting, on your product marketing, on your sales enablement templates, on your email marketing, on your social posts, on your ads, on your educational resources, on your educational events, regardless of whether they're in-person educational events or virtual events. Once you have strong clarity on who the company is and who the most important stakeholder and the second most important stakeholder is in those companies and what they care about on their own words, that gives you an enormous, enormous opportunity to simplify the sales process, because you're able to anticipate what this kind of person wants to know next. And when you're able to do that, you not only provide a much better customer experience, you've ever heard people talk about a CX or customer experience and a much better prospect experience, because you're only sharing highly relevant information for who they are and what they care about at each stage of the process. So you're giving them a much more delightful experience, but you're also accelerating the sales cycle quite dramatically, because every time they convert on one of your lead generation conversion paths on the confirmation page, you know exactly what to suggest next. And you'll know this is working beautifully, because as your inbound, as your lead generation starts to kick into high gear, it could be like 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon on a holiday weekend, where your entire company, except for a skeleton crew in your network operations center, is off. Everyone having to do with marketing and sales is on a 4-day holiday. No one's going to see these leads that are coming in for like another 48 hours, maybe another 72 hours. But because you're running ads, or you have social posts or great email marketing, someone who just happens to have a strong need for edge data center facilities, that only has time to research this in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, lands on your website. They convert on your landing page to watch an on-demand webinar. They get to the confirmation page on there. They're like, oh, in addition to learning more about how to find the right edge data center facility, there's a downloadable planning guide or a buyer's guide. Yeah, they'll click on that. They'll fill that out as well, because just like in e-commerce, when someone has their credit card out and they're in a buying mood, when someone's filling out forms and converting on offers, if you offer to provide more value to help them, guide them, Sherpa them throughout the next step in their buyer's journey, it's highly relevant for who they are and what they care about, they're going to keep consuming your content. And you'll know that this is having a magical effect, because you come in on Tuesday morning, 48 hours later, and you see you got a lead revisit notification from someone that booked a meeting on your calendar that you didn't even know existed before. And you click on the link to go look at their contact timeline in HubSpot or Salesforce, whatever you're looking at for this. And you're like, oh my gosh, this person consumed 37 pages of our content on our website. They converted on 11 different lead generation offers. They watched 2.5 hours of on-demand webinars while we were all on a holiday weekend. What do you think it's going to be like when that person comes to your free assessment call, your free consultation, whatever it is, to learn more about your edge data center capabilities or edge data center assessment? They're literally going to be quoting you. They're going to be quoting your own subject matter experts, because you took the time to understand who they are and what they care about, and proactively be able to provide all of these fantastic resources and on-demand experiences that they could do on their own time, even on a holiday weekend, that motivated them and enabled them to spend 3-4 hours of time on your website, basically getting like an express MBA in the edge and being a perfect buyer of your edge data centers, to the point where they likely almost know as much as one of your sales development reps knows on their first 2 or 3 weeks of being on the job employed at your company. This changes the nature of how you hire. This changes the nature of how you do professional development. This changes the nature of how you do workforce development and upskilling and reskilling your own internal team members, because the bar has been raised up significantly. But just recognize that if you don't provide these educational experiences, they're going to get them somewhere else, probably from one of your competitors. So the question is, do you want your best prospects for edge data center to see your company as the be all end all experts, or you just want them to see you as just another vendor that competes on price? For most people, you're going to want them to see you as the be all end all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with edge data center facilities for this particular kind of stakeholder in this particular geographic region for a particular company size in a certain kind of industry. So when it comes to simplifying your edge data center sales process, having these fantastic, hyper-specific, incredibly valuable educational resources that people can go through on their own time is fantastically impactful, because you're not only guaranteeing that you stay on the short list, in a lot of cases, you're knocking your competition off of the short list, and you're giving that highly motivated person the ability to literally self-propel them through the journey. Now, for more normal situations where they register for your on-demand webinar and they watch that, and then they go back to their regular life, but they're sitting in your email database, that's where having an email newsletter, that's where having regularly scheduled webinars that you invite them to monthly, quarterly, ideally more than monthly, like bi-weekly or even weekly, allows you to continue educating and building trust with that person and getting them to experience a live experience where when they see you and your team members on camera, they start the know, like, and trust on webcam. The know, like, and trust goes up even more because they're learning with you. Those are all the things that can queue up dramatically simplifying your edge data center sales processes, dialing in what kind of company they're coming from, what kind of stakeholder they are, what's top of mind for them, proactively providing these amazingly helpful educational resources that they can either access on demand or in a live virtual or live in-person setting. If they're local enough, you can do these events locally as well. But for sure, it's really, really critical for your best prospects to see you and your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with edge data centers. So you get out of commodity broker status. So you get out of the vendor buy. I mean, there's people that are selling edge and colocation that act like they're selling like WeWork for computers, like a co-working space for computers, where they're just really just selling glorified real estate. And if you're doing that and you don't really have a strong point of differentiation, it's going to be a rough road ahead to stay relevant. But at the other extreme, where you really, really see yourself as a technology services, as a digital infrastructure company, and you're focusing on providing this world-class customer and prospect experience, it's very, very possible to simplify it for your prospects. It's very possible to simplify it for your sales development, for your account executives, for your account managers, in a way that provides an amazingly delightful experience for them, that provides a really strong lead generation, lead nurturing, sales cycle acceleration for you, and provides great value for them when they go to onboard, getting them to initial value, intended value, and extended value, being very, very receptive to your customer marketing efforts, your account expansion efforts, your upselling, your cross-selling, whatever you're going to do to grow that relationship over time. But the more dialed in you can get into who they are, what kind of company they come from, and what kind of stakeholder they are, the easier it is for you to be able to dramatically simplify your edge data center sales process. So that's the final question that I'm going to be answering in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. Again, I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals, GTM professionals, in the growth of the data center industry. If we're not already connected on LinkedIn, just mention that you watched this show, send me a connect request, and I'd love to be connected with you. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter at www.dcsmi.com. If you have an idea for a future question or topic that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments. And if you just want to express your gratitude for getting some good value out of today's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. Until next time, I wish you great success in your journey to increase your relevance, your team's growth, and your company's growth in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. Look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.